Hudson didn't just drop the top on this convertible Commodore back in 1948, they also dropped the floor, which makes this car a revolution on wheels. Hi there, Rich Brule with another chapter in the automotive evolution here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, an amazing collection, more than 170 cars right here in Phoenix, Arizona. And each one of the cars is an interesting chapter in the automotive evolution. And this car right here, this 1948 Hudson, well, this is a very important story. We'll tell you more about that in just a moment. But first, make sure you like and subscribe. And of course, in the comments down below, let me know what I got right and of course, what I got wrong, because there's always something I get wrong. And of course, let me know if you have any interesting stories about your time that may have been spent in a Hudson very similar to this. But before we talk too much about this particular car, we want to talk about the fact that in the late 1940s, a lot of the American auto companies were not releasing their new post-war body styles until 1949. Hudson, however, beat them to the punch with this car. They brought their new lineup out in 1948. But once again, I don't want to go too much into this car before I tell you about the history of Hudson. You see, the Hudson Motor Car Company was founded in 1909 in Detroit, Michigan. It was named after a department store magnate. His name was Joseph L. Hudson. He's the guy who put up the money for a group who was led by a guy named Roy Chapin, who was a former Oldsmobile executive. By the way, Hudson unfortunately died just a few years later. Now, their goal was to build a car that was affordable, reliable, and easy to maintain, just like the Oldsmobile. By 1910, Hudson had become one of the largest automobile manufacturers in the United States. The company gained early attention for producing the 20, a four-cylinder car priced under $1,000. Now, throughout the 1910s and the 1920s, Hudson introduced several innovations, including the use of a balanced crankshaft. That's what they were putting in their six-cylinder engine. That helped to improve both smoothness and performance. In 1919, Hudson introduced a car called the Essex. It was a lower-cost companion car, but it was a separate line, and the Essex became one of the first affordable vehicles with a fully enclosed body, and that helped to shift consumer preference away from those cheaper open touring cars. Now, during the 1930s, Hudson adapted to the Great Depression by focusing on value and dependability. By the end of the decade, both Hudson and Essex, well, they had been consolidated into simply one company, which made sense, under the Hudson name. In the early 1940s, Hudson, like most automakers, had to stop all of their civilian car production. They had to focus on building military equipment for World War II. But in 1948, they introduced a car that didn't just look new on the outside, it was new underneath. It had an all-new frame that lowered the car's center of gravity. It lowered the profile as well. Hudson called it the step-down construction. The passenger compartment was actually inside the frame rather than sitting on top. The result? Well, it was a lower roofline if you had the sedan, a sleeker appearance, and a lowered seating position. Passengers stepped down into the car rather than onto a platform, which was a new experience for a lot of the drivers back then. Let's take a walk around and get a closer look at our 1948 Hudson Commodore from a styling perspective. And the first thing I can tell you is if you look at a 1947 Hudson, it is completely different than this 1948. I will say there is one similar element, and that is this grille down below, somewhat similar to what they had on the 1947. But from that point on, everything is different. We'll start with his hood ornament. Once again, everything in the post-war era was about aviation, rocket and jet inspired, and that's exactly what you had right here. In the 1947 Hudson, you actually had a very tall hood that came way up here. They flattened it out completely. I would say not quite as much as they did with Ford. They still have a little bit of a valley right here, but also probably a little flatter than what Chevrolet came out with in 1949. Very similar emblem up front on top of the grille to what they had in 1947, but it's going down the side where everything comes different on this 1948 model Hudson. Instead of big fenders off to the side that kind of curve back in, well, you see it's very sleek, going all the way down the side in one smooth movement. Not a lot of chrome, and it's just kind of really beautiful design. They've got a nice accent piece right here, which is important to point out. That also adds strength to the side of the body, so that's really good to point out. I love what they've done with the wheels. They have literally enclosed the wheels. Now, these wheel wells were more than just a styling touch. They were actually part of the engineering of the car with the chassis. That's because with this car, the chassis actually went outside, the frame went outside of the rear wheel. So if you wanted to change the wheel, you'd have to take off this little design piece right here, this styling piece, and then you'd have to lower the car, raise the car in such a way that the wheels were lowered. It was all part of that step-down design to get the frame lower. Look at that sleek side that they've got going all the way up. This was a very modern design. And remember, this came out in 1948. This comes out a year before the 1949 Ford or the 1949 Chevy or the 1949 Chrysler products hit the streets. Put this handle back down. We'll go in the trunk in just a moment. Very subtle on the back. It's got that Hudson name. This particular one is a convertible. I love the way they've designed this. We'll show that it's got a big, huge trunk in the back. We'll look into the history of Hudson. I love that old battery charger down there. It's been beautifully restored. Go up the other side just a little bit, same sleek lines. One thing that they do with the convertible, which is unique, is they have a very large section up here. A lot of the convertibles have a smaller section right here. This adds a lot of strength. It's also a little bit clumsy looking in some ways. They were still in the middle of having the two-piece windshields, which was similar to 1947. They wouldn't get away from that for just a little bit. But once again, from a styling perspective, boy, this car was radically different than the pre-war styles that were being put out in 1947. And remember, the 1948 Ford and the 1948 Chevy were still in those pre-war styles. So if you wanted something new and modern, well, a Hudson was one of the cars you absolutely had to consider. All right, we've got the hood up, so let's take a look at the engine in our 1948 Commodore convertible. Now, the standard engine in the 48 Commodore was a 262 cubic inch inline six. It produced about 121 horsepower, but it was really known for having smooth power delivery and strong low-end torque. But if buyers did want a little more power, a little more prestige, Hudson offered an 8-cylinder engine option. Now, it was not a V8, it was an inline 8, really long, 254 cubic inches, 128 horsepower. Really, the performance difference wasn't great, but it did have smoother acceleration and a quieter ride. But this car, here in the museum, actually has something pretty special under the hood. The original engine that came with this car is gone, and in its place is the legendary 308 cubic inch inline six that Hudson came out with in 1951. In its base form, it made 145 horsepower, but if you added the twin H-power carbs, that jumped to 170 horsepower. That's exactly what we have right here. This was the engine that helped Hudson and the Hudson Hornet become a dominant force in early stock car racing. From 1951 through 1954, Hudson Hornets with the 308 engine literally ruled NASCAR. They won dozens of races against the more powerful V8 engines. But part of that was due to that step-down design with the lower center of gravity. And of course, part of it was thanks to this great engine, this 308 cubic inch with a twin H-power and 170 horsepower. It was just the right combination, a perfect combination, in fact, for dominating NASCAR in the early 50s. I want to point out one interesting design element that's under the hood, and that's this right here. See these cables? These are for the windshield wipers. In the center over there is a little motor that controls them, and then these cables do the actuating. Instead of having a mechanical arm or two motors, it runs through here. And if you look, it goes around this pulley right here and then goes up and runs that up there. But it's an interesting way to put this together. Now, I'm not sure if it's better or worse. I kind of worry that these would either stretch out or break, but it was an interesting way to solve the issue of having one motor and two wipers. All right, let us step down into the interior of our 1948 Hudson Commodore convertible, because the reality is it didn't just look different on the outside, it was completely reimagined inside as well. Now, if you compare it to the 1947 Hudson, of course, the biggest change was simply the new step-down floor design. You know, the passenger sat, as I mentioned, inside the frame rather than on top of it. That meant a lower step in height. Also had a roomier feel. If you had the hardtop, you had more headroom. The interior styling, well, that followed the same modern theme. The speedometer went from a rectangle in front of the driver to a round speedometer and a clock over here set off to the side. It had gauges over a radio, very simple modern styling. Seat cushions, well, they were actually lower and wider as well because they could be taking advantage of that step-down floor. And the convertible offered generous legroom up front, not so much in the back. It's kind of tight back there. Materials for the seats were upgraded as well. In fact, they started offering two-tone paint schemes or two-tone color schemes, which of course became the rage in the 1950s. One other interesting thing I want to point out on this car is the fact that in 1948, Hudson introduced hydraulic windows. Now, I think power windows go back to 1940 with Packard. I think they were the first to produce them on a mass scale. 1948 is when Hudson came along, and their power windows, once again, were not electric. They were hydraulically powered. In fact, you've got 4 controls here to control the 4 windows, and at each individual corner, just like a modern car, you've got another one. If you want to open the wind wings, however, that was simply a device that you turned with your hand. One other interesting thing that I want to point out is when they moved the gauges to the center, they had room on either side. Apparently the plan was, well, they put a regular glove compartment over on this side, and here across from the driver they have another compartment. Now, I'm not sure whether this is supposed to have a glove compartment inside, a place to stick things, but this particular one here at the museum has nothing in here, so you can get access to some of the things you need to work on behind here. From a mechanic, I think it's great. I'm curious, if you know Hudson's very well, is that supposed to be a glove compartment, or is that just supposed to be a way to work on the stuff that's inside there? Either way, much more modern interior than 1947, and a big upgrade, especially from a comfort perspective, unless, of course, you're sitting in that back seat. Well, the Hudson may have been innovative in the late 40s. To be honest with you, its sales were just so-so. And even though they were making big headlines during the early 1950s by winning in NASCAR with the Hudson Hornet, well, those headlines really didn't translate into sales. You got to remember, back then, NASCAR was just considered a regional series back then, not the national force it is today. By the mid-1950s, Hudson was struggling to keep pace with the styling changes and the technology changes from their larger rivals. The company really lacked the resources for that ability to do major redesigns. It was losing ground. So in 1954, Hudson merged with a company called Nash Kelvinator to form a company we know of today as American Motors Corporation. The 1955 Hudsons really weren't true Hudsons. They were simply built on Nash platforms with new sheet metal. The last car to wear the Hudson name rolled off the factory line in 1957. And after nearly half a century, the Hudson brand faded into history. But not without leaving its mark. I mean, they did it through innovation, they did it through racing, they did it through a very distinctive design that came out in 1948 ahead of the other big companies. Unfortunately, these days, Hudson is merely a footnote in the automotive evolution.